It is Monday, April 28th at 7 p.m. and we'll go ahead and commence the meeting. We'll start with Pledge of Allegiance. Board Member Sue, can you lead us, please?
Yes, please stand. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, thank you. And we'll go ahead and start with roll call.
Yes, good evening. Board Member Hom.
Here.
Board Member Sue.
Here.
Board Member Ruiz.
Here.
Board Member Ariza.
Present.
Board Member Wang.
Here.
Board Member Saheba.
Present.
And President Cisneros.
Here.
Great. All present. We have a quorum.
Great, thank you. Next agenda item is agenda changes. Anything from staff or no agenda changes?
Not from staff, no.
Okay, or anyone else? Seeing none. Non-agenda public comment. Anyone here that wants to speak on an item that's not in the agenda may do so for 3 minutes. Do we have any public speakers?
I have no speaker slips and no hands raised.
Okay, great. And then we'll move on to consent calendar, no items. And do we have any public comment for consent calendar? Looks like none. Okay. We'll go ahead and move on to agenda item A, which is to review the short-term rental ordinance, continue the workshop and discussion. It looks like we have a staff presentation.
Yes, good evening again. I'm Steve Buckley. I'm the Planning Services Manager, and I'll be making the presentation tonight. I'm also joined by Heather Coleman, consultant, who worked with me on this quite extensively, and want to give her credit. I guess I might have failed to do that last time, but she's here tonight and here to also assist with answering any questions. This is our second workshop. We had one back in February and took some questions and had some commentary, and we've sort of worked through some of those issues and tried to give you a little bit more framework to work with. I also handed out a sheet this evening at the dais and in the hallway that just tries to frame some of the options again. It's probably imperfect at this point, but it's a starting point for a conversation about different ways of thinking about how short-term rentals are operated. But I'll go through a few slides here first, and then we can get into questions. So we're here tonight to report back on some of the answers to your questions from last time, try to expand on some of those discussion points, provide some initial recommendations, which are in the staff report, as well as some alternatives, and then get some feedback from the community. Just to reiterate, the reason we're here is that we committed in our housing element to explore limiting short-term rentals, which were characterized as conversions to hotels, which reduce the supply of long-term housing units for sale or for rent. And so we need to do that, in some sort of timely fashion. We're at least exploring it, and we have options in terms of what that looks like in the end. But we want to, in essence, preserve rental and homeownership opportunities while also allowing for some income generation and flexibility in how different housing resources are used, while maintaining neighborhood compatibility and the safety of those who are occupying these spaces. And then after we've formulated our regulations, just to make sure that they're very clear and consistent, easy to implement, and consistent across departments in the city so that we're all sort of pulling in the same direction. As we've discussed, the zoning is largely silent on the topic. We have a section on traditional B&Bs, which are in historic homes, and we have hotels, obviously, but we don't really have a short-term rental definition or regulation. And so these are really just operated as a business in the city. They're supposed to get business licenses, but many of them don't. They're supposed to pay taxes, and that's usually handled by the online platform. And so there's sort of this, I guess, gray market of short-term rentals in Alameda right now. And so they are also actually regulated by the rent program as exempt from those rent program protections, because these are not considered tenants if they're less than 30-day rentals. So we have something started, and we're just trying to sort of fill in the gaps. We have framed the issues in 9 different topics listed here, and I'll go through each of them quickly, I hope, so that we can get to the conversation. But just summarizing what was in the staff report. First, also responding to your earlier questions, there is evidence that short-term rentals do affect the local housing supply and housing costs from admittedly more tourist-oriented cities and large cities, San Francisco, Vancouver, LA. But there is evidence that at least in those circumstances, there can be an effect when there's a large market for short-term rentals. It's also true that, as we understood it, below market rate units, those that are deed restricted, are generally restricted in those agreements from being used as a short-term rental. So those tenants are not allowed to then sublet, in effect. There's some limited information from the police department about complaints about short-term rentals. They don't specifically keep it as, that kind of case, but it's just generally filed under nuisance or, disturbing the peace, that sort of thing. And the folks I spoke to didn't identify it as a large issue in Alameda, but it does happen. There was a question about business licenses, and yes, business licenses are required for the host. So even if they're using a platform and the platform is paying the taxes, the local homeowner is also supposed to register as a business, a home occupation in essence. And some of them may be miscategorized in the business license system as well. So we want to work on that coordination to make sure that we're capturing all the right data in the right places. And also, there was a question about the sort of 90-day limit, or what sort of limits are good limits. That is the most common, 90 days for in a given year that someone would use their home as a short-term rental as opposed to living there themselves. And that is the most common current sort of type of regulation. We weren't able to answer all your other questions about, I guess, sort of like how many absentee landowners are renting, or how many corporations are renting short-term rentals. We don't really have that information yet. And in terms of, in that sort of trend data or prevalence data, we don't have yet. We would need to probably hire someone to go scrape the web and see what they could find. We did also just want to mention that there's a pending bill that is meant to be a statewide opportunity for cities to actually request certain data of the platforms. And so right now, they're pretty tight-lipped about who their clients are and where they are and what they're doing. But there's a bill in the works that would give every city the opportunity to opt into that program. Just wanted to mention that as well. So back to the primary residence question. So I think this is the main one. We are recommending that these be essentially owner-occupied rentals rather than absentee landlords, and that they would be in the same house that owner or renter is in. Some renters are eligible. If they get their landlord's permission, they could probably do a short-term rental as well, rent out the extra bedroom. Or possibly the other option is to rent out another space on the property. So an owner might have another basement unit or cottage or something like that. So that's our recommendation, but you could also allow absentee landlords or certain, multiple property owners to use one property while they live in another property. This hosted and unhosted. So I made a little chart to try to describe that hosted and unhosted, what we're trying to describe. Maybe you already get it, but sort of down the same path of, is it owner occupied and is the owner there while it's being rented, or are they on vacation and they're renting it? Sort of like a home swap is the most likely kind of semi-hosted, where yes, it is their home, but they're not there, and so they're using it as a rental. But then there's also the possibility that they're just not there all year. And so those are the kind of scenarios that we're trying to describe. And is it a single unit property, just a home, or is it more of an apartment building? And that's where we get into maybe a bigger question of how many units on a property should be used as short-term rentals. I think I know where we might want to go with that question, but we need to be explicit about how we want to narrow the range of options. And then there could be time limits. Like I said, 90 days is typical, but some have, half a year or 2/3 of a year. And so there's a primary residence would be if someone lives there more than half the year. And that could be a criterion. So I won't go into all this. It's in the chart now. I think it's sort of all of those options are on the table. Our recommendation is that you limit it to owner-occupied properties, but maybe allow a second unit on the property to be used as a short-term rental. And let's see, that's what I described. And again, it could be a single family, it could be a duplex or a separate structure. But generally, we don't want ADUs to be used as short-term rentals. The law restricts them if they're more recent ADUs, but we could also claw back older ADUs. Also, we don't really want to use like commercial space or tents and things like that we talked about. But obviously, that's up for discussion. Tenants, again, we talked about this, that no deed-restricted units are allowed and no Ellis Act owner move-ins should be allowed to be used as short-term rentals, because that's really more of a tenant rights issue, and that's sort of what we're trying to get at. As well as we could restrict it to not in rent-controlled units, that is, those that are subject to the local rent program. Perhaps should be restricted from being used as short-term rentals instead. And there's a class of units that are subject to that program. We do recommend that you adopt some operating standards that would perhaps limit the number of people in any particular unit. It might be by people per bedroom, or just a total number of people in case someone rented a house and then had some friends over. We recommend that you require a contact person who could be available 24 hours within, say, a 30-minute response time in case there were a problem. We recommend that you also adopt certain safety features, like having smoke detectors and fire extinguishers. And then you could also even go as far as to establish sort of like, curfews for outdoor activity, require that they provide evidence of insurance, and maybe even establish some parking standards like no parking on the street, or no parking on the lawn, and those sorts of things that would be more neighborhood character kind of regulations that you might want to recommend. And then also that we discussed with the building official kind of this code enforcement and health and safety concern, and whether, and with the fire marshal as well, like, should there be inspections before a space is used as a short-term rental, because it's now sort of a public space in a sense. Should they be subject to accessibility standards or fire safety inspections or those sorts of things, and how would that be done? Our recommendation is that you use a self-certification form that is sort of consistent with HUD standards for livability, and so that before someone gets a short-term rental approval, that they would go through this checklist and verify that at least they understand these are the standards, and that they have at least attempted to comply with these standards. And so if we get a complaint later or something happens, at least we've done our due diligence to try to require some sort of inspection or certification. Or we could actually require a physical inspection by a home inspector or by a building inspector, a contractor, someone who could go in and actually, sign their name to something. We might also be able to require sort of random inspections by city staff. We're not recommending that. That seems like it's a little bit much to manage and also onerous for the operators, but that's one option that you could consider. And then in terms of how these are permitted, so right now they are required to get a business license, pay the taxes, and file with the rent program. We would recommend that they also then require this zoning clearance. That's typical for a business license, is they get a zoning clearance to verify that the use is allowable at this property. It could also go as far as having a separate kind of permit, which identifies it as a short-term rental. And so it would have a different code and perhaps different standards that we would go down a different checklist to make sure that they comply. And with that, we would probably need a new fee structure to be able to cover our costs for doing the compliance checklist and also for monitoring. In general, we've, again, identified some gaps in the system, so we just recommend that as part of this process that we improve this coordination and that we require essentially voluntary compliance with the checklist and maybe the zoning clearance or a separate short-term rental clearance, that we simply respond to complaints rather than try to have an active enforcement program. But we might want to try to get some data. And so the online data scraping is available for a fee. And so again, we'd need to cost recover that, but that seems like that would be helpful for tracking the volume of short-term rental activity. We don't really feel like we need much more than that, but you could also have a hotline for complaints or impose new penalties, but that may not be necessary in the short term. And so with that summarizes the staff report and our recommendations, and I'm available for questions.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. I'll open it up to the board for clarifying questions. Board Member Wang.
Thanks for that presentation. So one of the questions that I had reading through the staff report was, I guess, mirroring neighboring jurisdictions, or aside from what neighboring jurisdictions are doing, what would be the policy goal for us to take on a sort of days per year limit for any kind of typology? What's the outcome that we're seeking?
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess it's to sort of back up the idea that this is somebody's primary residence, for one thing, and so it would constrain further how far afield they would be from using the home as a primary residence.
So that would be it's either in an unhosted situation where the owner uses that property as their primary residence, and we're limiting them to using that residence as a short-term rental to X number of days per year, right?
Yeah. So it's a sort of belt and suspenders concept.
Right. But if we were talking about a semi-hosted scenario where the owner's there and we're limiting the short-term rental that's elsewhere on the property to, say, 90 days a year, I think that was the recommendation. I think in that scenario, I wasn't quite following what the sort of policy goal of that would be.
Right, well, I guess it's a disincentive maybe to use the property as a short-term rental then. And so it would be like, well, if the story is that this is just a side activity and really it's also my home office or it's also my gym, but sometimes I short-term rental it or we use it for family, then maybe 90 days or 120 days is enough in a year to sort of have that flexibility.
Right. I think that there's sort of I don't know if other board members are going to come to this conclusion, but there's sort of an inferred, like if there's a public interest in disincentivizing, say, backyard cottages as short-term rentals throughout the entirety of the year, there maybe is a connection to, is like a neighborhood character question, right? Like we don't want visitors coming in and out all the time or something like that.
Exactly, I think that's related as well. Yeah,
Okay.
the parking and the noise and the activity.
Okay. Thank you.
It might also be that I think if it's a bridge between a long-term tenant and doing something else with the property, or another long-term tenant, but there's sort of a need to fill in the gap, that might be another reason to allow a shorter period of short-term rental.
Yeah, I mean, I'm glad you brought that up because I think one of the other things I was taking away from that was if there's a policy interest in retaining or maintaining long-term housing stock, then having a unit be on the short-term rental market for 90 days out of the year is actually on an ongoing basis should preclude long-term housing, right? If something goes back onto the short-term rental market 90 days every year, that basically makes it impossible to rent that space out on a long-term basis.
Right, and I guess maybe it wouldn't be every year, but it would be allowed in a given year.
Up to.
Yeah.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Any other questions? Board Member Han?
Yeah, thank you for the presentation. I had a clarification question on the difference between hosted and unhosted. And I see this chart here, maybe this will be helpful. And then I saw the survey that you did, which I appreciate, where you surveyed about 6 jurisdictions to determine what's allowed, hosted, semi-hosted, and unhosted. I was a little confused because in looking at the cities, most of the cities allow for hosted, and then it also showed that most of the cities allow for unhosted, but then most of the cities do not allow for semi-hosted. So I'm confused about that because I always thought the primary difference between hosted and semi-hosted was whether the owner needed to be on the premise during the time of the rental, or they could be off-site. So what's I guess that middle category, semi-hosted, why do most cities not allow semi-hosted? Or is the definition something that I'm kind of confused about?
Understandably confused. We've been sort of trying to, in some ways, make up a definition that maybe other folks don't use. It's maybe a little nuanced, but I think in practice, I'm not sure that if someone is short-term renting their home, sometimes, I guess I'll put it this way, sometimes you see a listing and it says your own room, and sometimes it says whole house. Mm-hmm. And those are the 2 typical rental listings, right? But the whole house could also be the basement unit, or the whole house, because it has a kitchen and a bathroom, could be a separate cottage. And we're trying to capture that sort of in-between where there is an owner and an occupant, but it's not like they're actually sharing the same bathroom and kitchen with you.
Yeah, I guess the key point was whether they need to be on the premises during the rental, or whether they can be off-site. Then when I look at this table here, I see hosted A and B and semi-hosted A and B, and it seems to suggest that in both scenarios, the owner can be away. And I usually think of hosted, meaning they gotta be there, you know, and then semi-hosted allows them not to be there,
Right.
you know,
Some-
so.
That's one scenario. So you might choose that actually you want only the A category or something like that. And so I was just trying to lay out the options. So you might say, actually, no, we want them always there. So, of course, they might run some errands, they might have to go to work. So, you know, they wouldn't actually physically be there, but they would be available on site.
Then the other question I have, this is a definition question. When you say owner occupied, they don't need, can they be the renter? So
Yeah.
owner is meant to encompass that someone who rents out the property. They don't necessarily need to own the property.
Right. Just for
Okay.
clarity, I didn't want to use the term renter and short-term renter in the
Yeah,
same
yeah,
column.
okay, yeah. I think that's it for now.
Great, thank you. Board Member Luis?
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. A few questions on the staff report. Under the category issue number 3, type of buildings and spaces on page 8. Under alternatives, you mentioned something about rooming house. My question is, would rooming house be considered short-term rental, or is it, is it allow rental of different rooms within a dwelling unit to different parties without hosts staying there? So would that, does a rooming house consider short-term rental, or is it part of the long-term rental? Where does it fall right now in our zoning code?
A rooming house is typically more like unrelated adults
Right,
sharing a house
right,
without necessarily signing the same lease.
right,
So I would think of that as a long-term rental.
right. So that shouldn't be, it doesn't
Less-
belong here at all, then, right? If that's a long-term rental, that wouldn't be an alternative suggestion. I would consider that long-term rental as well, but it's kind of adding that in.
Well, right, so actually, it's not the same as a rooming house. I shouldn't have, I was just trying to maybe contrast it with a rooming house. Like, you do have rooming houses where people are there sharing a bathroom and kitchen.
Right,
This would be the same situation, but it would be a short-term version of
got
that.
it. Okay, thank you
Yeah.
for the clarification.
Yeah.
And then, 2 other questions regarding your recommendations for operating standards and health and safety checklists. Are other jurisdictions requiring these, either one or the other, or both? In terms of the operating standards, do other jurisdictions have operating standards in their ordinances?
Yes,
Okay, and how about health and safety checklists as well? Do they?
yes.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? Board Member Sue?
So you mentioned in your presentation about the ADU law possibly restricting Airbnbs, like newer ADUs being restricted. Can you expand on what you meant by that a little bit?
Well, the state, in their ongoing revisions to ADU law, have, I want to make sure I get this right, but let's see, ADUs constructed after 2017 are prohibited from being used as short-term rentals. That was the first time they adopted that law, and so it only applies prospectively. So the ones constructed before 2017 are eligible to be used as short-term rentals. But we could make a rule that says none of them are eligible for short-term rental. The problem with that is we have to define then what an ADU is, because it's not everything is technically an ADU, because we have lots of units, second units, that are on properties that are basement conversions, cottages, whatever, that predate even ADU law, so pre-85-ish. And so we have lots of those buildings with 2 meters, 2 addresses, but, you know, and so they predate ADU law. They're just units, but they're sort of like second units. They're clearly subordinate to the main house. And so those are, I think, typically what's being used as short-term rentals in Alameda.
Yeah, thanks. That's, yeah, the reason I ask is because it sounds like post-2017, like I'm having a hard time thinking about any type of second unit on a property not being an ADU these days, but maybe you can get away with getting around the law, but it seems like any kind of, you know, taking one parcel and you add a second dwelling unit that meets the definition of a dwelling unit, it seems like it would, by definition, be an ADU and therefore be restricted to be an Airbnb unit under state law.
Post-2017,
Post-2017, yeah.
typically, although we have zoning that allows multiple units. So someone could also just build a legal unit and not call it an ADU, but they use the ADU law because it has less restrictive zoning. It has 4-foot setbacks instead of 5 and 20, things like that. So that's
Yeah.
why people use the ADU
So
law.
you have to go and comply with all these other requirements, and small lots here, that'd be hard, unless you do like a lot split, but then you're not on the same property anymore, so you're not even getting around that. Okay, thank you.
And if I could also clarify, our local ordinance does currently prohibit ADUs being leased for less than 30 days. So if you did want to expand that, which you do have the ability to do, you would have to amend the city's local ordinance as well.
Board Member Ariza?
Thank you. I guess just listening to, I wasn't here at the first meeting, so I don't know if this was addressed, and listening to everyone's comments, thank you for the presentation, it is very clear, but I wonder if we could backtrack a bit and think of the goals, like for the city, as far as we're trying to not get units out of the rental market, or, I mean, it would be helpful just kind of to have them here at the kind of the front of the conversation, so we really know what we're looking for to draft this
Right.
piece, right?
Right.
I mean, I understand we are trying to also not kind of put burdens on owners or help them out if they need to make money, or like you said, rent during the short term a property between long-term renters. So I don't know, I wonder if there's such a kind of a narrative for the goals, or do we need to now, should we talk about the goals?
Well, Brian was able to pull up the slide,
Oh,
so we
cool.
can go through the bullets. But
Nice.
yes, first off is to preserve the supply of long-term housing, both rentals and ownership. But, you know, generally, these units would typically be available for rent otherwise. And so I'll tell you that it's about 1% of the housing stock is currently used as short-term rental from the data we have. And so it probably bumps up our vacancy rate as well, which is in the housing element. We have a vacancy rate slightly higher than our neighboring cities. And so vacant is relative, right? It means there's no one permanently living there. Nobody's claiming it as their home. And so there's a relationship probably there as well. But how that affects our overall housing price and market and supply, it's about that 1%. And so, counter to just preserving long-term housing stock available to rent, there's also this idea that it does benefit the homeowner or even the renter who's subletting on occasion when they're away or whatever, to have a little extra income and maybe be able to pay the rent or, you know, take a vacation. And so that's a countervailing consideration. Ensuring neighborhood compatibility primarily and maintaining safety is why we would have those performance standards and checklists. And fundamentally then making sure that we're collecting the right fees and taxes.
Okay, thank you for that. I think then to kind of address board members Han's question about the semi-hosted, why other cities are not allowing it. My understanding from the explanation is that the semi-hosted implies that there are 2 units and the owner only lives in 1 unit and is renting another unit, like a separate unit. So even though they are in the property, they are renting for a short term a separate unit. So that means that if that was happening, then you would be taking out of the market a unit. Are we allowing that right now in that 1%, basically?
Because we don't have any land use regulations, yes.
Okay. Thank you.
Board Member Sahiba?
Yeah, thank you again for the presentation. I just have a question related to the semi-hosted again. I'm just trying to connect the dots in the staff documents here where we talk about the data from 2024, and 78% are renting an entire house or apartment, and 22% are renting a room within a house or apartment, which just basically means the majority are in an unhosted situation, and a smaller percentage are in the hosted situation. But then the semi-hosted definition swings both ways. So we don't, can we break this data down a little further, or it's somewhere in the middle here, or where does it sit?
We would need more data, which is available for,
Okay.
for a fee.
I see.
They can also mine the data deep enough to know how many days a year a particular unit was actually booked, and for how much, typically on average. And they can thereby sort of determine this 90-day threshold, if we had one, or, again, so it would sort of imply either it was occupied by a long-term renter or an owner in the other times. So there are ways to break it down further, but it's tricky.
I guess that brings up a larger question. What's the benefit of defining semi-hosted?
Well, when we say it has to be owner occupied, I think that implies that it's one set of rooms. And I think I'm trying to capture the idea that there can be more than one set of rooms on a property. And I think that's the testimony we were getting last time we were here. And we want to accommodate that, perhaps. Or not. Perhaps
Right.
maybe we want every unit that's available to be rented long-term.
Okay. Okay. I'm just trying to understand this hybrid, and if it creates better clarity or confusion
Yeah.
in how we define our policy, essentially.
I think we would have to, in writing an ordinance, we would have to have a sort of a decision tree. Do you live on the property? Do you live in this unit? Is this unit, a full unit? Those sorts of things.
So then there's potential benefits of that scenario that we would then provide to someone who's semi-hosted versus unhosted? I mean, what's the end goal? Longer stays, or I don't know, I'm just throwing out ideas, but I'm just trying to understand.
Well, I
where-
think the testimony we got last time was that if we don't let them short-term rental it, they also won't long-term rent it because it's inconvenient or not what they want to do.
Okay.
And so that's just a different choice.
Okay, thank you.
Raising my hand myself. Oh, choose me. Thanks, fellow board members, for all the questions. I kind of want to build off of Sahiba's line of questioning because I keep referring back to our other jurisdictions regulations, and it seems like a precursor is the primary residence requirement.
Mhm.
And it's, let's just say we all under agreement that that should be the mandate. Then something like the unhosted would make sense because the owner or renter that gets a permission from the owner would live in that house for most of the year. And then it makes sense for the hosted because they'll both be living there. I guess my question comes in with, again, the semi-hosted. And I feel like we all asked a different version of this question, but why wouldn't we follow our peers? Because here, like, a lot of them said no to that, and I think the reason maybe is because of the ADU law, because it, and maybe we're saying yes because, and what you just outlined. But yeah, I guess I just wanted to hear another voiceover expounding on like the reason for us not following our peers versus saying, yes, let's do semi-hosted for X number of days.
Yeah, I think maybe the analog to the ADU law is probably the easiest reason why they don't, is they just figure, well, if you can't short-term rental an ADU, you shouldn't be able to short-term rental any available unit. And, you know, we have a rent program that kind of is intended to protect tenants and make housing available long-term at reasonable prices. And so, but they also do allow an exemption for short-term rentals. You can actually write down, I am exempt short-term rental. So they even recognize in the rent program that this happens. And so they don't have a prohibition on it. They just say, if you do long-term rent, then you're subject to the program. So it's kind of a weird gray area.
Yeah, it is. So I did also want to just chime in that I had a talk with the executive director of the Rent Board, and his understanding was that sort of the legislative history of the rent ordinance was that this short-term rental exemption at the time that it was written related to the short-term leases that were common for military families at the time. And it may, that nomenclature of short-term rentals now has been adopted and applied to, of course, you know, the Airbnb situation, but he believed that when the law was written, that the intent was to allow for short-term military family leases.
Got it. That's helpful. Thank you. And then this discussion has me wondering about another item here with the rent-controlled unit, like not allowing it as an offering for short-term rentals. What would be the drawbacks of that? Like, why wouldn't we just mandate that? Or
Well, I think it's a matter of allowing a tenant to take advantage of the same opportunities. Say they're traveling for a few weeks and they want to make their apartment available. Or in the case of a room available, maybe they rented a 3-bedroom apartment and their roommate moved out. And now they're trying to figure out what to do with this extra space and they need the money to make rent. This is a way for them to, you know, make up the difference. So I think rent-controlled apartments in Alameda seem like they should be eligible.
Okay.
Because they're not deed restricted.
Okay, that's helpful.
Yeah, and on the other hand, again, talking to the director, that if we have, apartment buildings and multi-unit complexes, the desire of the rent board would be to really limit the use of short-term rentals in those types of situations. And if, the board were to consider allowing a short-term rental in those situations, one option might be to then seek a removal permit from rent control to allow for a short-term rental, because we wouldn't want, multifamily apartment buildings all converting to short-term rentals. However, it's the 2 units that are a little trickier from a rent control perspective. And sometimes the 2 units are fully regulated, subject to rent control. And in certain situations, you may not want to, maybe it has been a long-term rental, and the rent board or the rent control folks are reluctant to see that unit then convert to a short-term rental.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that does get to the multi-unit building question. Obviously, it wouldn't be someone's primary residence if there's 4 units on the site. It could be, one of them might be, but we wouldn't want the 3 others to be short-term rented. I think there's definitely a threshold there.
Yeah.
And maybe that's why the semi-hosted are not allowed in the other jurisdictions, because that's kind of that's what stops someone who owns 4 units, let's say, and lives in 1 unit to be able to rent the other 1 or 2 or 3 other units to as a short-term rental, I think.
Yeah, and I have information that there are several buildings that are 4 or more units that are being short-term rented right now in Alameda. So, we would have to figure out how to resolve that over time.
Is one of the suggestions, what was it, something like limiting the host to just 1 short-term address? I don't know if that would help with that exactly, but it's okay. Never mind. Okay. All right. I think that's all my questions. Yes, Board Member Wing.
I'm wondering if you could speak to any of the context behind the rule in Alameda that an ADU can't be rented for, shorter than 30 days? What was the background? When was that passed? What was the background of that discussion? And what was the goal behind that?
I don't know, honestly. Brian might.
Isn't
I'm
there
happy
a
to-
state law?
Yeah, I'm happy to take a crack. I think as 2017, when the state started passing sort of housing streamlining laws, like the new ADU rules, they gave special, rules for ADUs. So you didn't have to meet the same setbacks. You don't have to pay an improvement tax in the city of Alameda. And so in order to take advantage of these special rules that sort of overriding the city's local zoning, therefore, you need to use these units to sort of address the housing shortage that these laws were adopted for. And so when the city adopted its ordinance, it adopted essentially a version of that state law. And so it's implemented. Our ordinance reflects the rules that the state was passing down from above, if that makes sense.
So, in a way, even though our zoning ordinance right now is blind to short-term rentals, this rule around new ADUs, post-2017 ADUs not being rented for shorter than 30 days was a sort of proto-short-term rental ordinance.
Yes.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
it definitely applies to a portion.
We have other remnants in our code that reference short-term rentals, like, you have to pay TOT on rental periods less than 30 days. It's kind of a patchwork of regulations.
But again, going back to what Steve was saying earlier, this applies to newly built ADUs that are taking advantage of ADU streamlining laws and kind of effectively leaves out all the stuff from prior to 2017 that may not technically be classified or known as ADUs, right? Because when I saw that note in our staff report, it sort of made me think of all the testimony that we got in the first workshop. It's like, gosh, that was a lot of people. Yeah.
Yeah, and there may be other, I'll just maybe confuse it further, but there are other buildings, that don't have a kitchen, for instance. They're not units, but they're spaces. There's
Right.
a suite, that might be
Right.
available, something like that. So what do we do
Right.
with that? Well, it's not really an apartment, so we're probably okay with that.
Right.
Okay. Seeing any more clarifying questions? All right, I think I have one more. How come we landed, or the staff landed on 90 days versus like 30 days or whatever? I don't know. It seemed like a nice round number.
Yeah, it's kind of what most other jurisdictions have.
Yeah, okay. All right, I think those are all our questions. I think we'll go ahead and move it to public comment. Thank you so much.
All right, so far I've got 3 speaker slips for in person. If anyone online wants to raise their hand. First speaker is Joe Kaiser.
Hello, my name is Joe Kaiser. I live on Otis Drive, and I want to thank everyone here, city staff, and all of you for taking the time to address this. My family has been living next to an Airbnb for 2 years now, and it's terrible. When we moved here in 2013, the same home, it's a 4-bedroom home, was rented to a very nice family. We had no issues with that family. We had very friendly relations with them. That family moved out. A set of housemates moved in. They were there for a number of years. Very pleasant relations with them. Then the owners 2 years ago decided to Airbnb the property, essentially full time. It's been terrible. There's at least once a month, if not more, there's large gatherings. It's supposed to be 8 tenants or 8 guests in what I call a hotel. There's often 12, 20, 30, 40, 50 people there for gatherings. The owners have become very unresponsive. They've told me basically I just need to call the police. They, in fact, this past weekend called the police on their own guests. I had to call the police 3 times. I just sent an email to Alan Ty this morning, and he CC'd Mr. Buckley on my email, which I would be happy for you to share with the board if they're interested. But it's just been kind of a nightmare for us. So I'm relieved to hear that the city is considering implementing new codes to deal with this. My problem is with the property specifically next door to mine, which is absolutely unhosted. The owners do not live on site. They Airbnb it probably 3/4 of the year. When it's not being Airbnb'd, it's just empty. Weeds are growing out of control in front. So the consideration for, at a very minimum, requiring some kind of primary residence or presence on site for my family would be life-changing, frankly, because the owners of this property need to be encouraged and incentivized to rent to a family, to rent to stable tenants, to take this off the Airbnb market immediately. So all the nuances about semi-hosted or nitpicking to make sure that the code is perfect to capture every possibility and permutation, I would encourage you to consider implementing something sooner rather than later, that it establishes a bare minimum requirement that the host be on site and that there be strict limitations on the number of days per year. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Next speaker is Luai Alkanji.
Good evening. My name is Luai Alkanji. I live here in Alameda on San Antonio Avenue. I also spoke at the last planning board meeting on this ordinance. I previously submitted a letter regarding the STR ordinance, and tonight I want to briefly highlight why the proposals before you are built on assumptions that deserve a closer look. First, the studies cited by staff deserve a much closer scrutiny. The British Columbia study was funded by the hotel lobby, a direct competitor to STRs, and relies heavily on data from Inside Airbnb, a project founded by a self-described activist. Bloomberg even described Murray Cox as the man trying to take down Airbnb. The context matters when considering the study's conclusions. The Los Angeles study, while serious, found that even in one of the world's largest tourism markets, STR restrictions only reduced rents and property values by about 2%, even after several years. Even based on the McGill study, only about 15% of frequently rented entire homes, the most commercial STRs, were removed after similar regulations. So 15% of 1% in Alameda. In Alameda, we have 300 to 350 STRs according to staff. So you can do the math. That's not a lot of housing units. Even using the city's own data and standard economic assumptions, STRs likely generate about $12 million a year, supporting over 125 local jobs if we use standard economic assumptions. None of this was included in the staff analysis. This is also very personal for me. My partner and I both have demanding full-time jobs, yet we can barely afford to stay here in Alameda. Our family, 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls, all under 10, rely on the income from our backyard cottage to make our mortgage. It's $8,000 a month, 7% mortgage. It's tight. We live on site with our children, a grandparent, and we have one close relative who's one close family friend who's a full-time student also staying with us. So it's a full house. Our home is full of life and community. It's not an absentee rental. Our children often play with visiting families. If we were forced out, it's unlikely our home would turn into an affordable rental. More likely, it would be snapped up by an investor, and the opposite of what this ordinance is trying to achieve. Hosting short-term allows essential flexibility, reserving the space for family and friends, using it for occasional private occasions, and in between, generating income, something that 90-day limits would severely restrict. Families like ours don't need unlimited STRs. We need enough flexibility to make staying in Alameda possible. We planned our lives around the city's rule. We followed them carefully. Please ensure that we can stay in Alameda. Thank you.
Thank you.
Next speaker is Steve Buss.
Good evening. I also spoke in February. My wife and I own a Victorian-era home in Alameda with what is likely a 90-year-old cottage in the backyard. For the last 10 years, we've rented out that cottage under Airbnb exclusively. For the last 12 months, we've rented out over 200 days. Restricting us to 90 days in a given year would have significant economic impact on us. Obviously, the city will also receive less transient tax. Even 100, I believe, San Leandro is 180 days is their limit. I also want to address the business license issue. We have a business license. After the last meeting, I met 2 people in the hallway outside, and we had a little conversation. I asked, well, do you guys have business licenses? They said yes as well. It's unlikely that we are 3 of the only 6. We might have the wrong business license. I went to the website and took a look as if I was applying, and it was very confusing of what type of business license affects me. And I brought this to Mr. Buckley's attention over email. As far as impact on the neighborhood, I pity my previous speaker and the situation he has next door. That's awful. I believe we're semi-hosted. Is that, if I understand the definition correctly? We live in the house, the cottage gets rented. We're there all the time. As far as impact on our neighbors, I can think of 5 of our neighbors who have had their parents come and stay with us. The only complaints I've ever gotten from a neighbor was that the cottage wasn't available when their parents were coming. And they shook their fist at me about that. So I know our situation is much different than the previous speaker, and I do feel sorry for him. I do ask that you consider people like us who have income-producing units that we would not turn into permanent rental or long-term rental, because we like the flexibility of having our family and friends come and stay with us and stay there when they visit. Thank you for your time.
And next speaker, Sheila Cahill.
Thank you. I'm sort of in the same situation as Steve. I have a duplex. I live upstairs and I rent the downstairs. My neighbors have all been very supportive of me. Most of my tenants are parents visiting their kids. And I'm retired and I'm dependent on the rental to help supplement my retirement. But well, sorry, it would be very hard on me if I do have a business license. I don't know if it's the right business license. It's the one I've always had, even when I rented long-term. Every year I apply for it. And I also pay the taxes for the hotel taxes that we have to pay too. So I hope you'll take that into consideration of people like me. Thank you.
We have no more speakers.
Okay, great. Thank you so much to the public for your comments. We'll go ahead and close public comment and bring it back to the board for deliberation. Board Member Wang.
Thanks. Thanks to staff and thanks to the commenters. I have a lot to say on this, so please brace yourselves for a speech. I don't think we have limits like council does, so after this we might change that policy. I don't know. I think we have bigger questions and we have smaller questions, right? And I think Board Member Arizo was kind of getting at. So what are kind of the principles that we're after in addressing the many questions, the 8 to 9 questions that we have here? So I think staff articulated well. You know, there are a couple impetuses for us doing this. One of them has to do with the fact that our zoning ordinance just doesn't talk about short-term rentals at all. So, you know, first and foremost, we need to recognize and acknowledge this thing as a category and therefore consider some level of regulation or at least recognition of short-term rentals. And the other one is, and probably the precipitating one is the housing element talks about, you know, short-term rental as being in conflict with our goal to have long-term housing stock. And I think it speaks about it in terms of a presumed connection between short-term rentals and the loss of some number of permanent housing units. I think as of now, we don't have hard data on, you know, what that number might be within the city of Alameda. But we're presuming that there is some kind of connection to, you know, if we were to have a completely hands-off approach that we have now, we're presuming some level of impact on long-term housing. So those are two big questions, right? And we can approach this question narrowly as addressing those two big questions, and we can also approach it broadly. So to say, you know, as long as we're opening up this conversation, what are some other issues that we should be thoughtful and mindful about as writing into the regulation? For example, are we doing safety checks? Are we regulating nuisance as well? So I think I just want to share my own philosophical view on that, because, you know, I do appreciate a good regulation, but good regulation isn't the same as more regulation. And the reason I say that is regulation is more process, and that means more red tape for the Alameda community, and it's also more administrative burden for limited staff time, right? So if we are going to embark on more regulation, I think we need to be judicious about how it's going to play out, how it's going to be enforced, how much money we're going to spend on it. Is it realistic that it's actually going to be followed? Because we don't want to write regulations that aren't going to be followed. So in this last category of things that we could be thinking about, I think I'll talk about first, because those are, to me, a little bit easier. And then I'll talk about the zoning ordinance and long-term housing. So I do think some of the things that staff proposed in this last category are good, are sensible, and maybe we can think of those as low-hanging fruit, like the self-certification and the health and safety checks. So yes, why not? And I also want to be sensitive to not having solutions in search of problems. So if there are systemic issues that are related to noise or to parking or to parties or special events, the city does have a system for dealing with those, right? So in other words, I don't have the sense yet that from a land use perspective, we're seeing short-term rentals as a category drive, you know, noise problems or parking problems to the level that we would consider it a land use compatibility or adjacency conflict. And I do have an exception there related to our first speaker, but I think we can get there. So I'm not sure if I'm saying that we need a legislative fix for noise and for parking and things like that. I'm happy to be wrong about that. And I think staff, the recommendation is on the same page, that the primary recommendation is like, well, those, you know, we don't need a fix there necessarily. For special events, I'm not totally sure. Again, do we have a recurring nuisance issue with special events that tell us we need to regulate short-term rentals as a category? I'm not totally sure, but I don't feel strongly about that one either way. So I want to, this is less, I think, of a principal issue, but it's been brought up, I think, a number of times by some of the speakers, particularly in the previous workshop, maybe not so much this one, because there is a question of fiscal impact. I think last time a number of commenters raised a very interesting point, very good point, that short-term visitors do spend a lot of money in Alameda supporting the economy and the community. I think it's a very good point. It's a nice one. I don't know if it should be a driving issue for us. I don't know if it's a principal issue. I think it's an important secondary one. If we accept short-term rentals as a housing typology that's one-to-one interchangeable with long-term housing, then I think we have to ask ourselves if there is a meaningful difference between the fiscal impact of visitors compared to the fiscal impact of long-term residents. I don't think that's necessarily a useful line of inquiry for us. I mean, everyone spends money wherever they are. But I don't know that short-term rentals are interchangeable with long-term housing. And I do think that's an important line of inquiry for us, and one that right now we're missing data on. So there's no doubt in my mind that in international tourist destinations like Barcelona, there absolutely is a short-term rental problem, right? Investors can buy up long-term housing stock and turn them into short-term visitor housing. And that's a huge problem for those cities. I think there's this big question of, is that a problem in Alameda? I'm not sure. We do, I think this was in staff report. The Bay Area has a region-wide housing production problem. So I don't, when we have region-wide pressures like this, we get families evicted from their homes. And the principal tool for that really should be just churning out lots and lots of housing, right? But in absence of that, we fall back to these other tools, which are they're good tools like rent control and like regulating short-term rentals. But we also need to be super clear-eyed that these aren't tools that generate more housing. They're more like stemming the loss of housing, which is super important. So thinking about long-term housing, we do live in a region with a very high cost of living. That means we have a not insignificant slice of our communities where we have 2 parent earners in a household, working full-time. They have their kids in daycare, or they're paying rent or mortgage. And often on paper, these families make a lot of money, and yet somehow at the end of the day, on a net basis, they're not actually super wealthy. They're just kind of getting by. And these aren't the families who have it the worst, right? They're not the ones who are one missed paycheck away from homelessness or some other catastrophic outcome. They're somewhere in the middle, and they're kind of making it work, or maybe they're seniors with extra rental income, and that's part of making it work in the Bay Area. They're lucky enough to have that extra piece of income. So I want to be super careful that in chasing a policy outcome, that we don't leave these families, these households, like as our collateral damage, because they're here, they're part of this community, and they're trying to make it work. I think so. I mean, clearly there are a lot of different kinds of building typologies within short-term rentals. I'll just speak from my personal experience, because a lot of what the commenters have said in this workshop and in the last workshop mirrored my own experience. So before our family lived in Alameda, we did have on our property, our primary residence, a backyard cottage that we used as a short-term rental for about a year. And it was fundamentally our swing space. We used it for storage. We used it to keep holiday decorations. We used it for family members and friends to stay in. We're parents of young kids, so on date night, the kids would have a babysitter in the house, and we would sit in the backyard cottage, and we'd watch a movie and eat pizza, and our kids could not disturb us because they were in the front house. And this was during COVID. Also during COVID, we had to rewire our entire house, and so we moved our family into that backyard cottage for several days. And that was an amazing gift for us during the pandemic, to not have to be anywhere else. And it was our property. We never used it as a long-term rental because we were never interested in being landlords. Our property was 5,000 square feet. The lot size was 5,000 square feet, and we didn't want to share our limited backyard space with long-term tenants. And we didn't have time to manage a tenant. I look back on the income that we made from that, and I do question a little bit the quixotic effort that we put into all that cleaning and advertising, because it was barely worth it, but it did help us to pay our mortgage, and that was meaningful. So I'll just say, if our ability to rent that cottage out short-term then was taken away, we would have been lucky enough to just eat that cost, but not everyone out there is, and we certainly never flipped it to long-term tenancy, nor would we have. So I think this is quite clear what I'm saying. I think we need to be very careful that we're not legislating for outcomes that aren't going to materialize. So I'll just quickly say what I'd actually be in favor of. I do support staff's recommendation that a short-term rental be on the same property as the host's primary residence. It could be as simple as that. Maybe there's another limit that says there's no more than 1 or 2 short-term rentals on that one property. I think this is super important. It would cut off, I think it would take short-term rentals out of the realm of speculative investment, which is where I think we genuinely start to see attrition in long-term housing supply. Again, whether that's a problem in Alameda right now, it's not super clear, but we do have the opportunity now to preclude it from being a problem at a minimum. We talked a little bit about this. I don't support days per year limits right now. I'm not totally sure that we need them for neighborhood character or for other reasons. And again, I think mirroring some of the testimony we got, on the flip side, these limits, the days per year limits would severely undercut the homeowners who are operating them for income support, and also not enable those units to turn into long-term housing anyway. So it's kind of a lose-lose. I don't support excluding ADUs from short-term rentals. It sounds like we already have a statewide ban on new ADUs. I think the pool of kind of these, unnamed units, backyard cottages or whatever they might be called, is pretty finite, and they're not going to grow. And those units, in my mind, like I said, they're very much swing space. I don't see them coming online as long-term units. I don't really see a material policy advantage to excluding ADUs entirely as a category from short-term rentals, particularly in light of the fact that the state law already doesn't allow ADUs built in 2017 and on from being short-term rentals. So I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for your thoughtful comments. Really appreciate it. Any other board members? Board Member Hom?
Sure, I'll chime in. Yeah, I agree with many of the points that you've raised, so I won't go through the philosophical, but I agree with how you've kind of framed a discussion. To me, the ADUs certainly is an affordability issue, but on 2 levels. On one hand, preserving affordable rental units, and you hear that as a strong argument in a lot of jurisdictions, including Alameda, is more prominent of an issue in more tourist-related locations than perhaps Alameda. But there's another affordability issue which members of the audience brought up, is being able to stay in your unit and generate income, especially if you're elderly, maybe on fixed income, and you've lived in a house for a long time. So that, to me, is also justifies ADUs to allow for that income potential, so. And then the other issue to me is, I know most ADUs are not problematic, but you hear about the horror stories of those that are. So it seems like, and I do agree with you, keep it simple, don't over-regulate, but putting in place some guard posts so that, so there could be, you could avoid the really onerous situation from happening. So to me, certainly agree that the ADU, the resident should be a primary resident. Person should be living there, shouldn't be a absentee landlord. And when I say primary resident, they could be the owner or the tenant living on the premises. To me, the key question is whether the owner, we'll say owner broadly, needs to be present on the site or not. And I see these options, yes and no. I tend to favor, at least for now, requiring that the primary resident needs to be on the site when the ADU is being rented, to be able to at least address issues that come up immediately. To me, there's less of a concern to me. I know we're coming up with this kind of definition of hosted and semi-hosted based on the type of unit. To me, I'm less concerned whether what's being rented as a room or a portion of a house or a cottage out back or a separate unit on site. I think all of that, I don't have a problem with. To me, the key is that should the resident be on the premises during the rental period? And I would tend to favor, I guess, they should be on the premises at the same time, regardless of the unit. A couple of things as far as, and some of this was brought up by staff. I like the self-certification process that Berkeley has. It's a pretty extensive checklist they have, but I like that checklist approach. And rather than having inspections, that seems kind of overly regulatory. Maybe include a good neighbor policy, so they have to sign a form. Include, a lot of this is kind of like voluntary, but at least they would acknowledge some good neighbor policies. I think some cities do that. Question of maybe only one rental at a time, so that you can have, and part of that may be part of the discussion, like I'm thinking, what if someone wanted to rent several rooms in their house? Should they be able to rent simultaneously all 3 rooms out? I tend to say maybe limit it to 1, or 2 or something along that line. Let's see. Staff addressed the issue of parties. I know a lot of ordinances don't allow parties. Obviously you want to allow for guests, so you might set a limit, like maximum 4 guests at a time. I'm just picking out a number, so that you can have guests, but you don't want to have the large parties. And I think limiting some of these things address some neighborhood compatibility issues. Like I do agree, we don't need to adopt special noise ordinances or traffic issue or parking requirements. I think if you limit the number of, like 1 at a time, or limit number of parties, or 1 per bedroom. I think staff talked about your maximum number of people in any one unit. Those items I think are good, and they will hopefully avoid some of the, the nightmare situations you read about in the newspaper. And I think this, police department, can address any nuisance issues, just like, homeowners have big loud parties too, not just short-term rental people. So certainly the noise ordinance applies to everyone as far as the nuisance ordinance. One thing I would suggest taking a look at, and this goes under the category of the purpose of ADUs under state law, and the reason why they're exempt from, you're not allowed to have a short-term rental for an ADU under state law because it's meant to streamline the approval of these projects for purpose of affordability. You might take a look at SB 9 units too, because that's been adopted by the state under similar premise that these duplexes or lot splits are allowed by right for the purpose of promoting affordability. So I'm thinking, if that's the case, maybe also not allowing short-term rentals for SB 9 type projects where you can actually build multiple units, like 8 units or so on a single family lot. So that's something to think about. Let's see. I agree, I understand the rationale for the 90-day limit. I just think, first of all, it sounds good, but it's really difficult to enforce. And part of me is that if we decide to only require the resident of the primary resident to be on the premises at the same time the rental, to me the 90-day limit is not as material. However, if we want to allow for owners be away, then maybe setting the limit of number of days might make more sense. Then the last point I had was there's discussion in the staff report about a zoning clearance or a zoning permit. And I guess this is more of a legal question. When I think of zoning clearance, you're basically saying zoning allows this. A permit might allow for a little bit more enforceability, and this is really a legal question. Like, for instance, a permit can be revoked. maybe a zoning clearance cannot. It'd be nice to think about if you have that really onerous situation, whether, where you have additional leverage, kind of last resort type of situation, of course, then at least you have that, the stick out there that their zoning permit for a short-term rental could be revoked. So anyway, so those are my thoughts.
Thank you, Board Member Hom. Can I ask a clarifying question? Because you said that you preferred the host being on site, whether it's within the same primary house or one of the houses on the lot. It sounded like, therefore, you do not support the unhosted scenario where the host would be away, unless there were a number of days enforcement. Like,
I think to me, I guess my definition of hosted and semi-hosted and hosted is kind of slightly differs from what staff came up with, which is fine, because there's no universal definition. Usually when I've heard a reference to unhosted, it means absentee landlord. You don't need to reside on the premises. You could rent out like a vacation home or something like that.
Yeah.
That's what I usually hear about what unhosted is. So I would say if you're going to require that the primary resident live on the property that they're operating, then to me, that's a hosted situation.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, yeah. And
Or
so-
semi-hosted. too.
Yeah. So, and therefore you don't.
Yeah, at least
Well,
that's how,
you don't
that's
like the
how I
un-
have categorized what unhosted means.
Yeah. So therefore you don't like the unhosted scenario as much, it sounds like. Okay, thank you. Did you have a clear thought? Okay. Sorry. Great. Any other comments? Board Member Sue?
Yes, so, let's see, I will, I primarily just want to kind of echo some of the comments that Board Member Wang made. I think, when he was asking his question about, what the purpose of the 90 days restriction is on the semi-hosted, I think what he was kind of getting at a little bit was, if we're trying to preserve housing stock, what is the 90-day restriction really doing? Because if you have 90 days, then you're not really going to even be able to rent it out for the rest of the year. And then I think kind of building off of that, his point saying that he doesn't really see right now in terms of, these semi-hosted dwelling units as creating some kind of housing problem because they're all being rented out as STRs. I kind of agree with him on that point too, primarily because, obviously Alameda is not, I love it here, but it's not like a hot tourist destination. And so to build off of that too, I also see that these semi-hosted, and I think this kind of might answer your question a little bit, Board Member Reeves, a little bit earlier. You were asking about why have all these other jurisdictions restricted it and why would we maybe allow it? I think it offers a certain type of product type that certain kind of guests who are visiting Alameda are looking for. I know from kind of personal experience, when I travel with my family with young kids, we oftentimes prefer Airbnbs that are just full dwelling units because it allows us to, make food for our kids. Our kids have special, unique sleeping arrangements where they need to be in a dark room with the sound machine on for hours. And so that's a lot better than being in a hotel room where you have to put them in a corner or something and hope they stay asleep. So I think that's kind of partly, at least the appeal for me from a kind of user of these dwelling units where I see the appeal. And I think it also makes sense for family visiting guests. So we, just as a personal example, actually, we used, I guess it was kind of like an ADU. I guess it was a home with a separate entrance with its own kitchen and bathroom, and we had to stay there because our sewer lateral was being repaired. So we were there for 5 days, and it worked because we were able to make food, we were able to stay, and I know there are some hotels that have extended stays or whatnot, but this was a great option. So I think that was the main points I was going to make. Yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Board Member Ruiz?
Thank you. Given that this is a workshop and you're soliciting feedback, so I'm just going to give you a very straight answer to each question that you ask of us. And I'm not going to repeat or belabor the point that other board member had already elaborated. This is just simply my personal feedback. from my seat. So your first question is about primary residence. I can be in support of being the same unit or the same property. I think those are benefits. I would caution where you mentioned that not a corporation. Some small families, they do set up LLCs to protect their financial interest, and wanted to make sure that is acknowledged. Okay, do not exclude that. In terms of hosted or unhosted, I'm in favor of both. I would like to further bifurcate those semi-hosted to away and those on-premise in multiple units. I am in favor of unlimited for hosted and unlimited for semi-hosted where the owner or the residence is on site, the host is on site. On the semi-hosted where the residents are away, the owner is away, I think that should be either limited in day or strictly prohibited. I'm not in favor of the unhosted. I think we would either completely prohibit it or limit it in days. Okay. Your question regarding building type, it's hard to say because I want to make sure I said the right thing. In agreement with the state law, ADUs post-2017 should not be allowed to be a short-term rental, and ADU priors or cottage units or extra space prior to 2017 should be allowed. I agree with your assessment and your recommendations about tenant and affordable housing. No derestricted Ellis Act or rent control units should be allowed on as a short-term rental. In your questions regarding operating standards, I want to be very careful. I think we need to be very careful about overreaching of government. In terms of regulating the number of guests and curfews, those are up to the landlord. I don't think anybody wants anybody to trash their homes, and that's usually in the rental agreement. So I would defer that to the landlord or the host who are setting up these recommendations. In terms of safeties and good neighbor policies, we already have ordinances that address noise. So I would not repeat that here and create potential conflict. Health and safety, I appreciate I'm sorry, I want to go back to one more thing. In terms of building types, number 3, building types. I understand that your recommendation is to prohibit anything other than a traditional building, and part of using Airbnb as an example, part of their platform and their draw is to create unique experience such as a tree house or a yurt. I don't see that many of them in Alameda, but I do know that there are some boats up for rental as Airbnb. That's right by Grand Marina. So just kind of keep an open mind. That's all I'm going to say. So I'm suspending my judgment on that. But back to number 6, health and safety. I appreciate self-certification because I think we need to be mindful of staff workload and how much we can take. In terms of the checklist, they need to be simple and straightforward, and it's more like a yes and no rather than pass or fail, because it's keep it simple, less than 1 page, longer than that, and also understanding what are we trying to regulate, right? Not every unit is accessible. Looking at Berkeley's checklist, does it have an accessible electrical outlet? Are we trying to get into that ADA realm? I think that's a little bit gray area. I would caution us going that route in the checklist. And also, there are some questions that is the plumbing line leaking? Well, how far do we go? Are we talking about sewer lateral? How do we check that, right? Those are things, so simplify the checklist so that the host can just go down as a yes, no, does it have or not have it, rather than pass, fail, because a lot of this is not necessarily pass or fail, it's just, do you have this feature or do you not have this feature? Buyers be aware. And those are, okay, so that's number 6. Number 7, I hear the public's comment, appreciate that, I understand, yes. My family tried to apply for business, and it is business license, and it is rather confusing, so we need to make it clear for the residents. And monitoring and enforcement, back to the original point, the goal is not to create more red tape, and so make it streamlined, make it simple, keep it simple, and you get the other ideas. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other, yes, Vice President Ariza.
Thank you. I appreciate everyone's comments. Thank you, Teresa, for breaking it down so clear for me so I can give my answers now in order. But I think I was leaning in that direction. And I mean, I'm happy that this ordinance is coming up, because I think even if it might not be a problem right now, it could be a problem later on. So we do want to get ahead of it. And even though Alameda is not maybe a tourist destination, I think the Bay Area in general is, San Francisco is. So I think it's good to have the ordinance and have some clear idea of what we are allowing and what we're not allowing, right? So I think that I understand the other jurisdictions' regulations, and I tend to agree with them, although I think that, yes, absolutely, it needs to be a primary residence. Hosted, yes. I don't think we need to restrict the number of days for that situation, like if the owner or the tenant is present on site and they want to rent another room as a short-term rental during the year, I think that's acceptable. For unhosted, I think I can understand the point of limiting it, because how do you enforce otherwise? I mean, if you're saying unhosted is that the owner or the primary resident is not at home when they're renting it, how do you enforce that if you don't set a limit of time? And I think that who would be able to actually ending up enforcing it would be the neighbors, right? Because they would complain about that situation. Anybody can say, yes, this is my primary residence, but then they rent it out throughout the year if you don't set up a limit. Now, what the limit of that is, I think I understand the 90 days as maybe the summer, assuming that a family leaves for the summer, and that's 3 months, and so that's 90 days, and they could rent their house. That seems reasonable to me. For the semi-hosted, I hear the kind of that balance that we need to reach, because there are definitely people currently that use that income as, that source of income to live in the Bay Area. But then how can we, and then in that case, we can't really set limits of time to actually make it work, right? It needs to be kind of unlimited. But how do we then prevent further units to go into that situation? That's the question. I mean, how do we then set up limits? Is it just you can only have one unit? Like you live in the property and a maximum of one unit that you can do as a short-term rental? Maybe, I don't know. I'm trying to see how can you find that so that it's not then like all the units or units in the future. And then for the ADUs, I think there's a state law, and I think that's kind of easy to follow and should be followed. And I completely agree with Teresa about, making it simple, make the form simple, and don't overreach on, limiting the number of people who can be in the short-term rental. Or I think that's up to the landlord I think ultimately that they include that maybe in the rental agreement if it's the tenant who does it or in the short-term rental. Yeah, I think everything else has been said. Thanks.
Thank you. Board Member Sahiba?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate all the public comments and comments from my fellow board members. For the most part, I'm in agreement with just thinking through unlimited time frame for hosted and semi-hosted. I will say again, I'm coming back to the metrics here, and again, the majority of the STRs in Alameda are unhosted. It sounds like to me, right? Where 80% were renting or 78% were renting an entire house or apartment, which again, I tried to, in my earlier line of questioning, I didn't know if that was like a unit where it's semi-hosted or not, which we don't have clear data on, I understand. So I would say but I would imagine if I just think through this, it's probably most of it's unhosted, but I can't say that for sure, of course. So the question, I guess, would really be is like, for me, policies are meant to adapt, meant to eventually track what this situation is over time. And maybe there's something in the policy where we do look at, on an annual basis, what is happening. Is there, again, this is a very small percentage of the overall housing stock we have in Alameda, as we described. It's not like Barcelona or other metropolitan cities. And so the real question for us is the trend going in one direction or the other? Is it going more towards unhosted? Is it going more towards hosted? And I know policies form direction as well. And I guess my question for us would be, when we're looking at this, how do we see if there's data that can help dictate the number of days that we go with unhosted? Because I can see like certain professions, like being a teacher or professor, you may want to leave for the summer, like you were describing, and still get revenue to pay a mortgage when you're gone. But there might be other professions where you're leaving for half a year. You're a consultant or something, right? You come back as this is home base. So I guess I'm not sure where the trend is currently with how much is happening with unhosted, and whether there's upper limits to start with and it ratchets down because we see a growth in that, or we ratchet it down now and limit the growth of that type. So it's really just a question of how the policy can continue to adapt over time, and if this is truly a challenge at the current moment, or it's a challenge in future years. That's something that I think is important to think through in a policy sense. Thank you.
If I may, just real quickly, I think you're onto something in terms of if we're heading towards owner occupant of the property or tenant occupant of the unit, it's a primary residence. They can prove that with, or at least mostly prove it with documentation, because you claim a residence for your tax purposes and other reasons. Then it seems almost self-enforcing in terms of the number of days on, if we're going to limit it to, say, one other space on the property, then maybe that's enough. It is really hard to enforce a day's limit without doing a lot of research and paying for that research.
Thank you, yeah. I really appreciate everyone's comments. I wanted to follow up just on this theme of enforcement. In the recommendations for one of them, it mentions contracting a third-party monitoring for short-term renters. And it sounds like you just said how challenging that would be for doing for the number of days. But can you just say more about that recommendation? Yeah, it's under the monitoring enforcement section, because it sounds like the staff talked about it, the staff saw a pathway for it in some shape or form. That makes me think that we could work backwards from that if there's a there, if it is feasible to in fact track the number of days, or is that just, like you just said, too challenging? Like, are you kind of countering the recommendation in the report?
Well, it depends on what you're trying to track and enforce. So I think it's being very precise on days can be challenging. They can do it to a degree of accuracy. And then you maybe need to be a little flexible on, is it 90, or maybe you bend to 100, 110, just to make sure you're not over enforcing again, or, then having a debate about, is it an accurate enforcement letter, and, just lots of problems with that. Versus you could use the online tracking for different purposes, like just finding unregistered ones, finding ones that aren't paying the taxes, finding the scofflaw is really what that is about, rather than trying to enforce very precise regulations. And so it's a matter of, and it's a communication tool too. I've used it in the past, and it's a service really, where they can send communication as Airbnb does to their clients. We could find them and communicate with them as well and say, hey, did you know Alameda has a new regulation? Hey, here's how you go about signing up. You have 3 months before we're going to do something. It's really easy. Here's the link. Here's the fee. And so, and then then they can send warnings like, we noticed maybe you didn't sign up, but you should. Rather than sending an enforcement letter. It's more of a communication tool, and then it's a tracking tool.
Okay. So it's something that other cities have used, it's something that you have used in the past, at maybe a previous role. It sounds like a huge burden.
It takes the burden off of us. It's about $15,000 or $20,000 a year. And so that would be the other reason. Then we need to set a fee. So
the business license fee.
Business license fee, a STR, zoning fee. But it would be, I think fairly nominal.
Okay. That's helpful. Got it. That's helpful. Yeah, I guess I bring that up just because I totally agree with my fellow board members that we don't want to over-regulate, and I really like the idea of thinking realistically of what the infrastructure looks like for a short-term rental ordinance, and weighing the pros and cons of like what that means for staff time, staff burden, et cetera. What you described doesn't sound awful. And so maybe when we come back, it would be helpful just to get a better sense of the picture of what that enforcement looks like. And another thing I think we talked about is like the permitting and how the type of permitting you would provide will help you with that tracking. So you're creating a new infrastructure system for this ordinance, which could be streamlined and not terribly burdensome for staff, which I appreciate. So just naming that, again, it could be helpful just to have a better picture of that. And, to your point, how do we get the funding for that? How do we look at the business license fee costs in order to support that infrastructure, so on and so forth? I think that would be helpful for me as part of like the ultimate decision making. I also really appreciate the discussion about hosted versus unhosted, what have you. I think we're all in agreement with the primary residence being a requirement, and unlimited for hosted. I am unconvinced about the unhosted being an allowable use. I also could be convinced otherwise, like maybe having a number of days. Like I was thinking the same thing, that some hosts leave for the summer, so like that 60 or 90 day makes sense. But if we were to go the unhosted route, I would definitely want the primary residence requirement to be tied to that. But I also agree with Board Member Hom, for example, maybe not entertaining it as part of the ordinance. I'm also not fully convinced on the semi-hosted short-term rentals. I do agree that this is not necessarily a problem now. We're Alameda, a small community. We're not Vancouver. We're not San Francisco, so on and so forth. And I do feel like this could set the conditions for a market in the future. And I just keep looking at our peers where, San Leandro said no to semi-hosted short-term rentals. Berkeley, in certain circumstances. Emeryville, no. Fremont, no. Piedmont, no. And we're going to say yes. And I do think I need more to better justify moving forward with the semi-hosted. And I actually was thinking maybe the 30 days made sense because it would match the state law for ADUs. Like, ADUs aren't allowed to be used for short-term rentals unless it's 2017 or beforehand. So it seems like there's some kind of mirroring opportunity there. So I'm just expressing my concerns about how to move forward with that for me. Another thing I'd like more information on next time we discuss this is this tension about using these units for long-term rental versus short-term rental. I wonder, what would it look like to create incentives for folks to want to become landlords? Is there an opportunity to do trainings and having a partnership with California Apartment Association, something just so we could help address maybe some of the barriers for folks that maybe would want to consider that path. Let me see if there's anything else I want to add. I think those are mostly my comments, but otherwise, yeah, I agree with my fellow board members on all the other issue areas, and generally when it comes to the final recommendations, I might need some more information on a couple items. Any other follow-up comments or feedback for staff? They'll be bringing this back to us. Yes, Board Member Hom.
Just one thing. Staff mentioned, I know you mentioned about the state legislation requiring, the hosting companies to provide information. I do like the staff suggestion about requiring the host, of those units to list their business license. To the degree we can enforce it, but that to me could help with enforcement, kind of self-education part of, because I know that from what I hear, most cities, the majority of the short-term rentals do not get a business license. So maybe requiring the listing of the business license might help kind of, psychologically tell them that you need to get a business license.
I was just going to circle back to that, SB 346. I was going to say it's another source of data, if it passes, where maybe we don't need the third-party online data. We just get it from the platforms and, use that. So we'll see how that plays out. Thank you so
I
much
just-
for your discussion.
I'm so sorry, just thought of one more thing. This is like totally random and probably too hard to research, but I am curious if other cities have done some kind of grandfathering program. I think of like how illegal ADUs have been brought up to code or something, so maybe for the existing semi-short-term rentals, that could be an option, but like future ones, not so much. So, yeah, I'm just curious if there's anything like that from other communities.
Yeah, or there may be a transition period,
Mhm.
again, for those multi-unit buildings that are already being used as short-term rentals. Get them back into long-term rentals.
Mhm.
Yeah, and,
Already so.
yeah, and I guess, I think to your point that how do we incentivize long-term rentals? I'm not sure if there's research on that or an answer or not. Maybe we can all look into that, but I don't know.
Mhm. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. I guess those are all the comments, and yeah, I look forward to bringing this back at the next board meeting, so.
Yeah, it won't be the next board
Or,
meeting, but it will
not
be
the
a
next subsequent,
future
but
board meeting.
in a
yeah.
future board meeting, yeah.
Yes, yes.
Okay, Great.
Thank you.
okay,
Staff communications is next.
okay,
I can just jump right in.
yeah.
The recent actions are listed in the attachment. There was one certificate of approval approved for tree removal under 6A and 6B. I think what I'll do is I'll start sending you out a list of what we have penciled in on your future agendas. Maybe that would be more helpful. So you can sort of anticipate before the packet gets to you. I think I mentioned before, Pacific Fusion will be coming to you. We also have another ordinance coming to you for inclusionary at some point, you know, and a couple of other projects in the pipeline.
Great.
Anything you want to add?
Thank you. Oh. Anything else?
Okay.
No? All right, thank you. Closing item 6, moving on to 7, board communications. Yeah, board member Ruiz.
I will be absent next meeting.
Okay. When is the next meeting? I should
I'll be absent next meeting too.
know. Oh, dear.
May,
Oh.
yeah, May
Oh,
12th.
the fall spring meeting, yeah.
May 12th, and then the meeting after that will be a Tuesday. Mark your calendars. It'll be a Tuesday, the 27th, because we have a holiday.
Fair.
So the next one is the 12th.
The next one is the 12th, though.
So, ooh, then I'm gonna be out the 27th as well.
Good to know. Thank
So
you.
I'll be out the 12th and the 27th.
Got it.
Thank you. All right. If that's all, we'll close agenda item 7, open it up for non-agenda public comment. Anyone wish to speak on something that wasn't on the agenda tonight? If not, we'll go ahead and close that, and we are adjourned.